Hello, Noam
Uh,
Scheiber.
hey, how are you?
I'm doing well. This is Conn Carroll. I'm a senior editorial writer with the Washington Examiner.
And I'm Noam Scheiber. I'm a senior editor with the New Republic. And I guess we're going to kick it right off. First item on the agenda is the fiscal cliff. And a lot has been written and said about this, but as we get to the final days and hours here, I guess my sense from reading the coverage, and I haven't talked to people on the Hill personally, but my sense is definitely um, if Mitch McConnell were to decide to take things into his own hands and do some kind of deal with Harry Reid, that he probably could get that through the Senate, and that would in turn isolate John Boehner. And I think it would play out about like the payroll tax cut did at the end of 2011, beginning of 2012, where the House GOP was initially very resistant, but found itself isolated when even the Senate GOP had kind of abandoned it, and they had no choice but to sort of get on board. But having said that, I see no indication that McConnell wants to do that. He's obviously up for re-election in 2014. There's chatter about a potential Tea Party primary challenge. I don't think serious chatter, but he's certainly concerned enough that he doesn't want to tempt fate. And, on top of which, maybe he feels like he's already collaborated with Democrats on these pieces of legislation, whether it was the payroll tax cut or the debt ceiling resolution that gave us the fiscal cliff, and wants to let Obama and Harry Reid sort it out themselves. So my sense is, I think when you kind of boil it down, Mitch McConnell probably has the power to save us, from this fiscal cliff diving fate, and I get no indication that he's going to use it. What's your sense?
I would mostly agree. I think we are looking at pretty much the same playbook as the payroll tax fight. I do think you're overrating McConnell's position here. He's a powerful guy, but ultimately Obama doesn't need his support in order to get 7 Republican votes to cross over and break a filibuster. Democrats already have 53 votes, well, 51 Democrats plus, the 2 independents, which vote for Democrats anyways. They only need 7 more in order to break a filibuster. So they don't really need McConnell. And those 7 votes are actually, when you look at it, really easy to get. You look at Collins and Snow, the Maine sisters. They're pretty much a done deal. Brown is desperate to vote for something Obama supports. He's about to run in a blue state. That's 3. You've got Johnny Isaacson out of Georgia and John Cornyn have already said they would support pretty much the exact same plan Obama floated on Friday. Now you're up to 5. You've got Lisa Murkowski, who's always easily bought. Then you've got, Dick Lugar, who's retiring, and everyone knows he'd like to stick it to the Tea Party. So that's 7 votes right there. That's 60. You're done. If Obama wants to avoid the cliff, he can do it. He can do it without McConnell. He can do it without Boehner. He can pretty much shove it down their throats. Boehner doesn't have to take up whatever the Senate passes, but in a joint statement with his leadership team, McCarthy, Cantor, and everyone else yesterday, he promised he would bring up whatever the Senate passed. So if Reid and Obama go get those 7 Republican votes, which are easily gettable, then we'll not go over the cliff. The tax hikes, at least for those under $250,000, won't happen.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, your analysis suggests that in the end, Reid and Obama want to go over the cliff because they think the politics are favorable to them, and I certainly wouldn't dispute that. The one thing I'd maybe take issue a bit with is even if the 7 votes are theoretically there, in order for this to really happen, you need that dynamic that you had during the payroll tax cut, which is not just something passing the Senate, but passing essentially with McConnell and the Senate GOP leadership's imprimatur. That's what really isolates the House GOP. Now, as you say, I mean, Boehner's words
why is that necessary to isolate? Why is that necessary to isolate the House GOP? Why is that necessary for a fiscal cliff deal?
Yeah, I just think I think unless the House GOP sees the writing on the wall politically, that they're going to be pretty resistant to this. I mean, as you say,
they'll be resistant to it. Whatever the Senate passes, I can guarantee you, Boehner and Cantor and McCarthy will all vote against. But they promised to bring it up, and I'm pretty sure Obama could get 30 Republican votes to pass it. I'm not suggesting that Boehner will see the light, but I mean I think the larger issue here is that I don't think both sides really care about the policy. I think they want the win, and like so many of your colleagues have been writing over at the New Republic, they really want to see the conservative wing broken and demoralized, and that is more important than any policy goal for them. So they think they have a better chance of getting that done if they go over the cliff. And what I'm hearing from you now is the goal really isn't preventing the tax cuts. The goal isn't the policy. The goal is to, as you say, isolate the House Republicans. That's the real political goal. That's what Obama is trying to accomplish.
Well, so I agree with that. I mean, my view is that Obama should try to accomplish that because I think the second term is sort of a non-starter without that. But I'm less persuaded that Obama himself believes that. I think Obama is sufficiently anxious about the consequences of the fiscal cliff, going over the cliff, that he would like to avert that.
Well, Obama does have to have a plan about what to do about House Republicans, right? I mean, whether it's immigration or gun control or really anything he wants to get done on any issue, he's going to have to develop a game plan, right? And so what's that game plan going to look like?
Well, no question, but I on the second term going, I think you want to separate issues into sort of doable and non-doable. I mean, he'd love to pass some kind of climate change legislation in the second term, but that's just not going to happen. Even if the House became marginally more amenable to working with him. But something like immigration reform, I think, where you have GOP constituencies who are very much in favor of it, just kind of changing the underlying sort of reflexive rejectionist dynamic could actually lead to getting that done. So that's a situation in which I think sort of breaking the fever on the right, to use Obama's lingo, could actually help. On gun control, I'd love to be able to. I'd love to think that we can do something, but I think that's regardless of the shape and state of mind of the House GOP. It seems hard for me to imagine that something meaningful is going to happen. I think on gun control, the bigger breakthrough is just getting people on record, in the Senate and in the House, so that going forward, if the shape of Congress changes in the future, you have people who voted the way you want them to vote, so that when you're trying to put together a coalition going forward, you might have a shot in the future.
Right.
So I'd sort out, I put issues in different buckets, and immigration would be one that I think, you could actually do something, in Obama's second term if you were just able to kind of tamp down the mania in the House GOP.
Well, I have yet to see any immigration debates where the mania was tamped down. I mean, there's definitely divisions within the Republicans on it. And they're largely the same that you have on this taxes, right? I mean, you have the corporate America, CEOs, the rest of them who basically said, yeah, let the individual rates go up, as long as the corporate rate and our corporate tax rates are protected, we're fine with individual rates going up. We don't really care about small businesses anyways. And you have the Tea Party wing saying, no, there's a principle here. We've got to be against this. We made promises, and we're going to keep our promises. And I think you're going to see the exact same thing play out on the immigration side. I don't think you're going to see Boehner and Cantor get their caucus to sign up with the CEO wing of the Republican Party and go with some type of guest worker program or anything like that. It's just not something that it's just not where the caucus is at. The votes aren't there. Just like there weren't the votes for Plan B, there's not going to be any votes for any type of amnesty deal.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I don't see the Tea Party really evolving on this anytime in the future. I think the bigger hope for Obama is that Boehner or a future successor on certain issues just becomes more open to working with a coalition of 40 to 50 Republicans and 75, 185 Democrats.
I do think
on most issues, but on something like immigration, or even a future fiscal deal, maybe have a shot if you're able to persuade them. And again, this goes back to the previous point about isolating House GOP. If you're able to persuade them that, the politics of this are going to be so brutal for you that even, your counterparts in the Senate don't want to stand with you. This is just, it's just pain. It's a lot of pain.
Right. And I think
tax that was playing out.
I think Obama and the Democrats are in for a long string of frustration and failure until they realize that they are not going to be able to isolate and humiliate the House GOP like that. I mean, you said you're hoping Boehner comes along and this new leader comes along to govern like that. I think that's a mistake for Obama to keep trying to negotiate with McConnell and Boehner. Those grand bargains with those leaders are not going to happen. If Obama is going to be able to get a deal before the fiscal cliff or a grand bargain afterward or immigration or anything, it's not going to come with negotiating with Boehner or McConnell. It's going to become going issue by issue and vote by vote and going through the roll call of the House and Senate and figuring out which Republican they can pick off one by one. That's the only way Obama's going to get anything done.
Well, I completely agree with you that negotiating with Boehner is a waste of time. I mean, it turned out that Obama thought he was negotiating with Boehner all this time, but he was not. He was negotiating with a majority of the House GOP, which wasn't nearly as amenable to what he was proposing as John Boehner appeared to be. So I agree with you there. It was a complete waste of time. And it shocked me, frankly, that Obama didn't learn that after the summer of 2011 and persisted with that same model after the election. I thought it was pretty clear then that whatever John Boehner's feelings on the subject and whatever his willingness to do a deal was pretty much irrelevant because he had to sell not only the other people in his leadership team, but the people they represented in the Republican caucus, and he was just not, he was just considerably to the left of where they were in his willingness to do a deal. So on that, I completely agree with you. Maybe it's worth segueing, though, to kind of what's at stake in this fiscal cliff deal, which is just the future of the welfare state. Or certainly, if I think you talk to conservatives, they would see it that way. I'm thinking about things that have been written over the last month or two. Ross Douthat had a blog post where he made this point, and Yuval Levine of writing a National Review made a similar point that their feeling was Democrats and Obama have to get as much revenue as possible out of this round because it's the only way that this whole welfare state that they've nurtured and in some ways contributed to through Obamacare is sustainable. If they don't get at least a decent amount of revenue now, this thing, the seams start to show real quick because the liabilities gallop ahead of the money to pay for them. And so this thing is actually kind of a big moment for liberalism and for the welfare state. And I'm curious if you see that too. I mean, if you're conservative and you see it that way, then the flip side is, and you want to kind of starve the welfare state, or at least force it into a situation, force Democrats into a situation where they have to talk about serious reform. Maybe you think that the imperative on the right is to hold down revenue as much as possible, just to bring up the day when Democrats have to deal on this stuff as soon as possible. And so I'm curious. I mean, do you sort of buy their analysis on this stuff? Do you see this as the kind of Waterloo of the welfare state?
No, I think it is going to be a telling moment, not a moment, but telling couple of months. Because if we do, at least if we go over the cliff, if Obama is able to cut a deal, then if he gets the 250,000 that he's talking about now. That's only $800 billion over 10 years. That's not nearly enough to, put a dent in the deficit. So, we'll keep going through these. We'll have these eternal debt limit and budget negotiation fights So we're going to be playing the same movie over and over again. On the other hand, if we do go over the fiscal cliff, and taxes do go up by, $450 billion this year alone, $4.6 trillion over 10 years, those taxes are going to hit the middle class. They're going to hit a whole bunch of people. They're going to hit a whole bunch of Americans. And even those aren't going to be enough to close the deficit. It'll be a good chunk. But the Democrats will get a lot of revenue. And we'll see if the American people really want to pay for an Obama-sized government. If we go back to the Clinton rates, if we go back to the rates we had in the 90s, plus all the taxes Obama has thrown on since then through Obamacare, et cetera, we'll see how much the American people like that tax burden. And if they don't, then I think we'll see more people voting Republican and a paring back of the welfare state. But there's also a risk for conservatives. What if we go over the fiscal cliff? Americans see less money in their paychecks each week. They send more money to the United States Treasury this April 15th, and they're fine with it. If that happens, then it is kind of a big moment for liberals. They will have gotten Obama-sized government and Obama-sized tax rates to pay for it. And both parties will have to adjust from there forward.
Yeah, I think you make a really interesting point. I think you're right. I think the best hope for conservatives, somewhat perversely, is for all the Bush taxes to expire, because that would, as you said, wouldn't completely balance the books over the long term, but it would sort of get you a big chunk of the way there. And then for the middle class to just wake up and decide that this is more than they want to pay for, given what they're getting in return.
Right, because that is the big myth that Obama tried to sell, is that you can afford Obama government by just taxing the rich. Right. And the honest people on the left, Iglesias, Klein, they all admit that you can't pay for Obama-sized government without taxing the middle class. So right. Now we'll see if America is willing to pay those taxes.
Right. No, I think the flip side is if we just allow the Bush tax cuts to expire on the rich, that, it would seem, as Dafford and Levine have laid out, that it brings the moment of reckoning forward, because this is the liabilities just are beyond what we can afford to pay for. But in fact, I think that gives long-term lease to the welfare state that Obama has consolidated and helped add on to, because basically Americans will see a bunch of programs that they like very much, Medicare, Social Security. I assume when Obamacare is fully implemented that people are generally going to like that too, at least people middle class and lower. And they will also see that it doesn't cost them a whole lot, right? Their tax burden is still pretty low. And furthermore, in the future, when a Republican Congress tries to scale back any of those benefits, that scaling back will be incredibly unpopular, as we found historically. And so, basically we'll proceed until we just can't anymore. But any attempt to do it before the absolute moment where we can no longer afford to do this, I think will be politically, it will overwhelmingly favor Democrats and the sort of defenders of the welfare state and status quo. So I kind of agree with you. I think perversely, it's a situation in which the middle class taxes stay pretty low and the welfare state kind of stays more or less in place. That is more problematic for conservatives than all the tax cuts expiring.
Yeah, people like free stuff. Democrats have an easy time. When you get all these cool benefits, you get free birth control, you get free health care, you don't even have to have a job, you don't have to go to work, you get unemployment insurance, and nobody has to pay for any of it. The top 1% will pay for everything, which means 99% of the population gets to vote themselves rich. It's an easy thing to sell.
The one thing the one wrinkle I would introduce into your analysis is, obviously you can't fund this whole project by taxing the rich, or at least not at levels that we're prepared to do. But
you can fund it by having the Fed monetize the debt.
Well, yeah, so you can do that for a while,
possibly forever. We'll find out.
But there's another source of revenue which I think has been overlooked a bit, And Barney Frank has actually discussed this in a couple of his sort of exit interviews, and that's defense spending. I mean, Bull Simpson put it on the agenda. Obviously in the sequester, a big chunk of it comes from defense. If you look at polling, both in the abstract in terms of should we roll back our overseas military commitments and specific conflicts, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, whatever it is, unless there's some sort of direct imminent threat to the country, Americans tend to be pretty opposed to sort of long-term military commitments overseas. There are potentially hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars over sort of decade timetables there. So I think, if we're getting to the point where Americans are just refusing to rein in the welfare state, you're probably going to be talking about some combination of upper income tax increases and a slicing the Pentagon and our overseas presence quite a bit.
I got two responses there. One, I think there's a very limited amount of money you can squeeze out of defense. Defense spending as percentage of GDP is already at historic lows. If you look at any chart of projected government spending in the future, it's all dominated by entitlements. Defense is a shrinking share. There's just not a lot of juice to be squeezed out of that fruit there. My second point would be that I think a lot of people in the GOP and the conservative movement are actually moving that way.
Yeah, I think so too.
Rand Paul definitely is. And I've been surprised. I don't want to name other names, but I've talked to other really super conservative senators who have voiced a surprising amount of ambivalence about the defense sequester cut. Why do we have bases in Germany? Why do we have bases in Japan and Korea and the rest of it? I do think there is there always has been, a kind of isolationist, bring the troops home part of the conservative movement, and that obviously wasn't there in the Bush years, but perhaps because of the larger failure of Bush, that wing has grown, and I do think you will see that side of the conservative movement grow over the next 5-10 years.
No, I think that's right. And just on the point about the money, I wouldn't suggest that you can find sufficient savings to fund Medicare and Obamacare, 30, 40 years in the future. But I think, the ultimate aim on liberals' part will be to sort of muddle through as long as possible. And, it'll be twofold. It'll be one, muddle through, and two, try to extract savings from the healthcare system overall, which is to say not cut Medicare benefits per se, but just within the healthcare system, in some of the ways that Obama tried to do with Obamacare, find new efficiencies, new ways of delivering care that lower costs across the system. So I think that's kind of priority one. But two, to the extent that doesn't get you the whole way there, will be to sort of muddle through with a combination of sort of upper income and maybe upper middle class tax increases and, kind of savings where you can find them in the defense budget. And I think that's going to be kind of the game over the next generation or so, basically.
Right. I think the liberal game plan is to, turn the heat up slowly on the frog in the pot, right? If we immediately switched from what we have now to the British national healthcare system, Americans would scream. But if waiting lines for doctors go from, you can't get an appointment, in a week, you have to wait 10 days, that's not nothing over a year. That you can barely notice that. Then, it's like 2 weeks and 3 weeks and a month. But if you went from, a week to a month, 2 months to see a doctor overnight in 1 year, American people would notice that. Soon when liberals talk about, getting all these efficiencies out of the healthcare system, really that's just price controls, which will only, limit supply and make it harder for Americans to get the healthcare they want. They'll have to find other ways to ration it, queuing, etc. So that's the road that the liberals would like us to go down. And conservatives have to have a game plan for that. I think their best bet is federalism. Their best bet is to preserve as much freedom for the states as possible so that American people can look at a state like California, which embraces the welfare state, the Obama model wholeheartedly, and raises taxes goes with the healthcare exchange, goes with climate change, does everything in the liberal playbook. And they have, they have the nation's highest poverty rate. They have the third highest unemployment rate. They have the highest inequality. So, people begin to see what that result bears out. And then you look at someplace like Texas, which has much lower unemployment, marginally lower in income inequality, not as much poverty, much better job growth. And
highest rate of lack of health insurance
coverage. Absolutely. No, you're right. That's a huge difference between California and Texas. Because California has a not as high as Massachusetts, but still a huge number of people with health insurance. Texas doesn't. My point is that conservatives try to preserve that choice, allow Americans to look at, hey, do I want to live in California, be unemployed, get UI, maybe go on disability, but I'll have health care, or do I want to live in Texas, not have health care, but have a job and opportunity? Americans will be able to vote with their feet and go to which states they like better.
So a couple things. One, I agree with you that, this is going to happen whether we try to do it or not, right? You're going to have a certain number of red state governors who reject Obamacare and don't want the Medicare supplemental money and don't want to set up exchanges. The government is empowered to come in and set them up for them, but there's an enormous amount of foot dragging that can happen here, and so I think we're going to set up this comparison across certain blue states and red states, and people will vote with their feet. My view is, in addition to a state like Texas, or in a state like Texas, in addition to not having healthcare, a lot of these jobs that you're talking about are pretty low-end service sector jobs that pay, pretty small amount per hour. So the unemployment rate can be a misleading statistic too. But I agree with you on the broad point that yes, I think there will be a decent amount of voting with people's feet over the next few decades. And I have to say, I think it'll probably go in the direction that the polls suggest it'll go. That people may rant about the growth of the welfare state and government consuming more and more of the economy, but when it comes to Medicare, don't touch their Medicare benefits. Second thing I would say, you mentioned this passing about rationing healthcare. That's certainly the sort of nightmare scenario that conservatives often dredge up. But I actually think there are a reasonable amount of efficiencies just from the way we incentivize the provision of healthcare. Fee-for-service is terribly inefficient and encourages all sorts of wasteful procedures and tests. And I think the Obamacare took some preliminary steps in trying to remove some of those disincentives. Some of the other experiments they did, the comparative effectiveness research, if we know what works and what doesn't, or at least we know something definitively is a complete waste of money and time, it makes sense to create incentives for doctors not to use that procedure in the future. The point isn't that any one of these reforms is likely to be a magic bullet. The point is if you kind of seed, a couple dozen experiments within a major reform effort like Obamacare, I think you probably will get some big return on that because one or two or three of them will end up paying off. So I reject. I mostly reject the idea that we're gonna kind of squeeze excess cost out of the healthcare system primarily through rationing.
I think that's the ideological difference we're not going to be able to solve here. I would just point people to Massachusetts, where we have, Romney care, Obamacare already, and you've seen wait times go up. It's harder to get a doctor. Pretty much everything that conservatives had said would happen is happening. We'll see if that happens.
People love it. The polls are pretty. The people are high on their Romney care.
The people that stayed there do. Other people leave the state. People have been leaving the Northeast and California and blue states heading to red states. 2 million people left California for Texas in the past 10 years. Another 150 some odd thousand did just this past year alone. For the first time ever in California's history, the past 10 years saw more Americans leaving the state than coming in. The only reason they're growing is because of mostly illegal immigration and births. As far as the inflow-outflow of Americans, California is shedding people.
I think you put your finger on an interesting dynamic, which I think we're not just going to have this sorting the sorting process isn't going to be sort of monolithic. My gut would be that among non-college grads for whom the unemployment rate is relatively high, you will get different migration patterns than college grads for whom the unemployment rate is pretty low and never got very high, even at the height of the recession. I mean, it was still 5% or something like that. So I think you're right. I mean, I think people for whom they have fewer professional opportunities, and the job market is just much tougher. I think you're going to get a lot of migration in places that are growing, even though it's not the jobs that my friends and I who write earnest policy treatises, in the 20001 zip code would wish on other people. Whereas the people who are college educated and have a reasonable amount of professional opportunity, I think they're going to prefer, by and large, to live in places that have larger government, that have more generous social benefits. And it's a little ironic, I guess, because in a way, you could argue that both sides would be kind of, moving against their economic interests, right? More affluent, can probably provide for their own, healthcare needs.
Yeah, but they feel better about themselves, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that is, I agree. That's what we're seeing, right? You're seeing highly stratified, high inequality states like California, where you have a bunch of kind of lower income people who benefit from the welfare state, but then they're not getting jobs. They're not entering the workforce. They're not developing the skills. They're becoming an underclass. They're growing in number. And then you have a bunch of affluent professionals that don't need the government services, but they feel better about themselves having, coming together and paying for it. And then you have the large middle class, which is gone in California, just left out of the state. I mean, unless they're a government union, unless they're, work at the DMV, nurses, healthcare workers, etc. They left already, or they're leaving now. Manufacturing's dead in California.
I mean, if you look at places in California like the Inland Empire, I mean, there's a pretty large, working class, lower middle class,
and they're leaving fast, right? I mean, it wasn't that long ago. California still actually made cars. Not anymore. They don't. They're made in other states now. And that's largely the future. Apple's bringing back all these jobs. I think a whole 100 of them. To the United States. They're not going to California. Those manufacturing jobs. I think they're going to South Carolina or Texas. So I mean, I think you're going to see a lot higher income inequality in the blue states, and everyone else, settling for red states like Texas.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, as I say, I think it's debatable, what a $10 an hour low-end service job with no benefits gets you in a state with no...
Gets you job skills. It teaches you to show up every day. It keeps you...
It gets you a job, but not necessarily one you can support a family on.
No, but it gets you on the ladder.
Well, as you say, we're probably not going to resolve this one.
Probably not.
Today either, but let's just move on briefly in the few minutes we have left and talk about the future of the GOP. I mean, I think, it's certainly a sub-theme of this conversation. I think, as you say, I mean, one of the things that struck me just in this, and this is on the kind of ideological level that we were operating on, but it's still relevant, I think, with the future of the GOP is, I think that because something like the Ryan plan was just, whatever the substantive merits, and I think they're slim, but you could think that they're significant. But I think it's just basically a political non-starter. That it strikes me that most of the conversation about reforming the welfare state and a lot of these big programs will happen among Democrats rather than between Democrats and Republicans, just because what the Republicans their idealized version of what they want to do is so unpopular. And to do anything, they'll need enormous amounts of political cover from Democrats. And why should Democrats give it to them if they can just have a conversation among themselves? And that, to me, seems to be a problem with the GOP over the long term, which is, the sort of top items on the agenda are sort of deeply unpopular in their specifics. And it seems to me hard for a party to to sustain itself over a period of several election cycles, if that's the case, if sort of the center part, that what's at the core of its agenda is just sort of fundamentally deeply unpopular, and they don't have the credibility, even if it were necessary, they don't have the sort of the political credibility to pull it off.
A lot there. I don't think Romney lost because of the Ryan plan, right? I mean, African American turnout was the highest ever was, for the first time ever higher than white turnout. And that's not because of the Ryan plan. Asians didn't turn out in record numbers. Hispanics didn't come out in record numbers because of the Ryan plan. Youth turnout was higher than it has been in years. And it's not because, Ryan screws over seniors or anything like that. I think it was very clearly, brand Obama that brought all those people out. Katy Perry didn't put on a skin-tight rubber dress because she opposed the Ryan plan.
Though she would.
What? Oh, you think she would?
I think she needs very few excuses to do that, but go ahead. That's a debater's point.
Fair enough. But to your larger point, you are right to one extent. I mean, like I said before, the Democratic agenda is free stuff for everyone but the 1%, and we're going to stick them with the bill. So if you're in the 99%, that's an easy sell. And the Republicans have a harder case to make. There's no doubt about it. And that's the challenge of conservatism for a long time, right? Tax cuts were a benefit for a long time. Democrats and Obama seem to have realized that they can play that game too. Promise tax cuts for everyone but the 1%, and you've stolen the GOP's playbook. But as we talked about before, that's not sustainable. Eventually, you can only get so much out of the 1%, and you're going to have to start taxing everyone else. And I think at that point, when the Democratic goodies, the welfare state, when we get to the point that you can't fund it without raising middle-class taxes, that's where the conservatives are able to come back in and say, look, you really have to start asking yourself how we want to order society. Do we really want government doing all these things? Are you really getting what you pay for?
So two quick points. One is you're absolutely right that, Obama is sort of obviously historically popular among African Americans. His margins among Hispanics were historically unprecedented. And the youth vote certainly...
Well, it's not even the margins, it was the turnout.
The turnout, yeah. And turnout among young folks as well. But, at the same time, there were a lot of sort of countervailing forces, right? Unemployment was near 8%. The country, believed we were on the wrong track, even on election day. But, a month or two or 6 before election day, the numbers were almost overwhelming. So there were some strong headwinds as well. And so if I were a Republican candidate, in 2016 or 2020, I wouldn't reassure myself to say that this was just a kind of sui generis thing. And once Obama's exited the stage, things will revert to their historical norm, and we'll be fine. If for no other reason than, even though Obama was sort of uniquely situated to drive up turnout in these communities and run up big margins. It's the wave of the future, right? The white share of the electorate has declined consistently since I think 1992 or 96. It's not likely to revert to its sort of 1980s or early 90s level really ever again. And the Hispanic, share of the electorate is likely to continue to rise. So even if you think that Obama was a sort of historically unique figure, I do think it foretells trouble for the GOP. The second thing I'd say is, setting aside the Ryan plan, I do think at the margins there was some effect, and I think I wrote about this a bit during the campaign. I think in some of the polling, at least for the kind of couple weeks where Ryan was really being showcased, before he went into hiding, that did not play well for the Romney campaign in places like Florida. But set that aside, I think even if you look not at kind of entitlements in the welfare state per se, but just on some of the things that were actually pretty central to Mitt Romney's political persona, more kind of tax cuts for the wealthy, preserving the tax preference for capital gains, just things that Mitt Romney was kind of the sort of poster child for, and not in a good way. I think that's sort of deeply problematic for the GOP going forward. I mean, it just, what shocked me about the campaign is it would have been so easy, and Mitt Romney would have gotten so much mileage from saying, you know what, people like me have done incredibly well in this country, and there are so many people who are less fortunate than me, and I think that we should just, there's no reason I should pay a lower tax rate, effective tax rate than the average, working class American. We should raise the capital gains tax to, not even to the income tax level, but to, 25% or whatever, 20%. And we should close the carried interest loophole that allows hedge fund managers and managers of private equity funds to pay the cap gains tax rate on their income, what's essentially income. I mean, a couple of things that would be essentially symbolic would have gotten such a huge return on something like that. And yet, I think it's not just Romney personally, but the way the party is structured that makes those kinds of things very difficult, if not impossible. And I think that's just a huge problem going forward. I mean, to me, the biggest, the most important data point and the most telling in the exit polls was the number of people who thought Romney favored the wealthy versus the middle class, and it was like 53% thought Romney's policy would favor the wealthy versus 34% the middle class. And for Obama, it was not quite the reverse, but basically the reverse. And I think something like 40-something% thought his policies would favor the middle class, and only like 10 or 15% thought his policies would favor the wealthy. So that to me is just is a problem, and obviously. In the same way that Obama was sort of uniquely situated to boost turnout in these demographics, Romney was like uniquely situated to evoke, these kind of not so useful images of plutocrats in voters' minds. But that said, I think it's something deeper than Romney. It's sort of a structural problem. I mean, if you remember, the one time that Romney flirted with higher taxes on the wealthy was at this fundraiser that he thought was off the record or not being covered. I think in April, not long after he wrapped up the primary, and it got out, and the Tea Party folks went nuts, and Romney had to completely backtrack, even though it was so benign. It was like he wanted to, end the mortgage interest deduction on vacation homes or something like that. So it's not just Romney; it's the party, and I think it's a real problem for the party going forward.
Yeah, I don't think not running raise taxes is the biggest Republican problem with the Republican Party right now. I think their larger brand is a much worse problem of just not being inclusive. When you look at states like when you compare California and Texas, right? They have identical Hispanic populations, and Texas actually has a kind of slightly larger white population. But also has a slightly larger black population because blacks have been fleeing California faster than the middle class has been fleeing California. The big difference between California and Texas is there are virtually no Asians in Texas, and there are a sizable number of Asians in California, and they are all voting Democratic in margins greater than Hispanics. And the Republicans need to figure out why, and they need to do something about it. Because that's going to be another growing demographic in this country, and they cannot lose that demographic by those margins if they want to stay competitive.
Well, I agree. I think inclusiveness is a problem. I don't think it's the only problem or even the most important one, but maybe that point of agreement is a good place to wrap this up.
Sounds good.
Well, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you. No, talk to you later.
All right.
Bye.
Take care. Have a good New Year.